This is the story of Ozzie and Daniel Silna, two brothers who made hundreds of millions of dollars doing absolutely nothing. Now, I guess you could say they didn't technically do nothing, since they caused the series of events which eventually made them all their money. And I suppose we all forge the chains we wear in life. But my point is that these guys truly didn't have to do a single thing while collecting their millions. In the 1930s, the Silna's parents moved to the United States from Latvia, a country that I could tell you the exact location of if you gave me like 4 or 5 guesses. Their father started a textile business, which Ozzie and Dan joined in the 1960s. Then they took their textile knowledge and started a knitting company, which sounds like the same thing as a textile company, but what do I know? 2 years later, they sold their knitting company for a small fortune, becoming the envy of grandmothers everywhere. With the money they had made, they decided to buy a basketball team. Apparently, the two of them had become obsessed with the sport as children, and since they knew they were never going to play for a team, they settled for owning one. In 1974, they offered to buy the Detroit Pistons for $4.85 million. And if that sounds like an incredibly cheap price for an NBA team, that's because it was cheap back then too, and the owner rejected the offer. Realizing they may have set their sights too high, the brothers turned from the National Basketball Association to the American Basketball Association, a rival league that existed at the time. Even in the 70s, the ABA was already considered a pretty pathetic competitor to the NBA. But the Silna brothers were hoping that the two leagues would merge and their ABA team would turn into an NBA team. So they bought a team called the Carolina Cougars for a clean $1 million. Then they scrapped almost the entire roster and moved the team to St. Louis, changing the name to the Spirits of St. Louis. This may seem like a bold choice after just buying a team, but it was all worth it to move from the hopeless North Carolina area to the bustling market of Missouri. But the people of St. Louis still weren't crazy about them, as the team sold only 600 season tickets. The Silna brothers apparently spent between $2 and $3 million on the team, generating no profits at all. So now that our main characters have lost at least $3 million, you may be wondering how this story turns into them making a ton of money. In 1975, the ABA quickly began to collapse. At that time, there were 10 ABA teams in operation. By 1976, 4 of them had folded. So the ABA and the NBA finally decided to combine their leagues, which was less of a merger and more of a complete takeover by the NBA. So the Silna brothers celebrated their longtime dream coming true, as their team would finally be able to join the NBA. Except for the fact that the NBA only wanted to add 4 new teams, which meant that 2 of the 6 remaining franchises would cease to exist. And indeed, it was decided that the Spirits of St. Louis were one of the 2 teams who wouldn't make the cut. And it's hard to imagine why, with how many great qualities the team had, between their average fan attendance of less than 1,000 people and their logo that looks like poop. The only good news for the Silnas was that the NBA now had to buy them out. The other team that was being folded was the Kentucky Colonels, owned by John Y. Brown Jr., a businessman who had made millions by turning KFC into a national fast food chain. The NBA offered the Silna brothers and Brown Jr. each $3.3 million to buy out their teams. Brown Jr. took the money and ran. He later became governor of Kentucky, which was an easy win as he was the first ever successful person from Kentucky. But the Silna brothers didn't want to finish this whole saga barely breaking even, so they began negotiating a better deal with the NBA, with the help of their lawyer Donald Shupak, who might have the most lawyerly name of all time. The deal that resulted was this. The Silna brothers would be paid a lump sum of $2.2 million while also receiving 1/7 of the TV money from each of the 4 ABA teams that were joining the NBA. In other words, the Silna brothers would get about 14.3% of all the money those 4 teams would make from broadcast deals for the rest of time. That's right, it was specifically said in the contract that the deal would last for as long as the NBA or its successors continues in its existence. So even if Skynet managed to take over the world, they would still be paying royalties to the Silnas well beyond Judgment Day. And now you see how the Textile brothers made their fortune. At the time, the league was 28 teams, which meant that the Silnas were receiving 2% of the entire NBA's TV revenue for doing absolutely nothing. In the early 80s, when the NBA was on the cusp of really blowing up, the Silnas were making about $500,000 a year. By the 90s, they were racking in over $4 million a year. By the year 2000, they were making over $12 million a year. And by 2010, the Silnas were receiving $17.5 million every year for not owning an NBA team. 10% of it was going to Donald Shupak, since he negotiated the deal, which is the least they could do after he got them infinite money for the rest of time. In terms of passive income, this is about as good as it gets. Granted, there are guys like former Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer, who will be making $1 billion this year in dividends alone from the shares of Microsoft he owns. But he actually had to earn that stock by working for the company for 34 years. Whereas the Silna brothers are the first people to ever make hundreds of millions of dollars on a bad investment. Some members of the grain train might recall my video on Bobby Bonilla, the baseball player who also crafted quite the passive income contract. And the only reason the Mets owner agreed to the contract was because he was investing with fraudster Bernie Madoff, who was promising higher returns than the interest on the contract. Well, it turns out that Bernie Madoff had his hands in a lot of these stories, as the Silna brothers invested millions of dollars with him in the 90s only to lose it all. It was never revealed exactly how much they invested, but it seems like it wasn't a huge chunk of their change. It did get them embroiled in a lawsuit, but I can't imagine that's enough to make them regret the contract. By 2014, the deal was bringing the Silnas $20 million a year, and it was estimated that they had made about $300 million total. Finally, the NBA realized that they should probably find a way to stop paying 2% of their TV rights to the owners of a team that hadn't existed for over 40 years. So they negotiated a buyout with the Silnas for the low price of $500 million. And somehow that still wasn't even a complete buyout. We don't know exactly how much they retained, but to this day the Silnas are still receiving a small portion of the TV rights for the Nets, the Nuggets, the Pacers, and the Spurs. Which means that Ozzie and Daniel Silna walked away from this whole thing having earned $800 million, with more still to come for the rest of time. All for buying a shitty basketball team that nobody ever watched. So with their inspiring story in mind, here's a little piece of business advice they won't teach you at Harvard. Invest in a failing sports team that's part of a collapsing league in hopes of merging into a more successful league, but make sure the team is so bad that they won't let you into that league, then parlay your ownership of the team into hundreds of millions of dollars by banking on the sport's popularity exploding in the decades to come. Simple as that. Now please consider subscribing, or I'll make you figure out the difference between a textile company and a knitting company.